Ben Shapiro is one of the hottest young right-wing commentators out there, so a lot of people have differing opinions about him. One of the topics of debate most common is if he is a racist. I personally take such a charge seriously, so I don't want to attribute this label to him if it isn't accurate. His detractors will say he absolutely is a racist, but his fans will say he absolutely is not. So what's happened is that whether or not Shapiro is a racist has become predicated on whether or not the person being asked is a fan of his. I'm going to state for the record that I am no fan of Ben Shapiro's, but this doesn't mean that I think he's a racist. I think he's wrong about a lot of things, and I'll talk about a few of them in a moment. But the first question I do want to address is if he's a racist. Now, in order for us to know whether or not Ben Shapiro is a racist, we have to first agree on what a racist is. A racist, according to the dictionary, is somebody who believes that there are inherent differences between racial identity groups that make some superior to others in one way or another. This is the belief held by folks like David Duke, Richard Spencer, Stefan Molyneux, and Jared Taylor. I have not found anywhere Shapiro has explicitly stated such beliefs like this himself. That doesn't mean, however, he doesn't hold these views. It just means I've never heard him state them publicly. And to be fair, I also have not found anywhere he has stated the opposite, that the races are inherently equal. I'm aware a lot of people on the left might feel as though my definition of racism is overly narrow, but I want to be clear. This in no way suggests that Shapiro's rhetoric about people of color hasn't been deeply problematic. It has, and I'll talk about why in a little bit. I'll even go as far as to suggest that while Shapiro may not be an open racist, he certainly has been an enabler of systemic racism, mainly due to his outright denial of its existence. I don't think most issues people have on the left with Ben Shapiro is that he's a racist in the traditional sense of the word. He certainly is an individual that holds prejudiced views about Black people. He doesn't seem to particularly care for them or like them very much. He probably wouldn't want to live in a predominantly Black neighborhood, nor do I suspect that he does. Again, this doesn't make him a racist in the traditional sense of what a racist is. A bigot, perhaps. A bigot is simply someone who just doesn't like a certain group of people. Somebody who has negative feelings about them and acts on those feelings. Many people on the right hold deep-seated prejudices against Black people, I believe, because the only education many of them get about Black people is what they see on the 6 o'clock news and what they hear about from people like Ben Shapiro. They certainly aren't getting much of an education about Black people from spending any length of time around them.
How can you argue that racism is not a driving factor in income inequality?
Because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. And when you have a culture that doesn't, and when
Shapiro often criticizes Blacks by criticizing their culture, completely ignoring the fact that the environment in which Blacks live, as well as their history in this country, might have some effect on their culture. The environments Black people are often found in, as well as the attitudes they might have, are due at least in part to systemic racism and white supremacy, both historic and current. Distrust of law enforcement? You don't think that's the result of white supremacy when throughout history the police were used as the mainline paramilitary defense of it? The drug war, police brutality, beating Blacks in the middle of the street with billy clubs during the 1960s? Here's a question I always have for white people. What have police actually done well for Blacks? The answer I get often is they keep Black people safe. Do they? You hear the right constantly talk about how dangerous Black neighborhoods are. Yes, the Black-on-Black homicide rate has drastically fallen since the 1990s, which is something people like Ben Shapiro never talk about. But to suggest that police are doing this wonderful job of keeping Black communities safe is absurd. There are many reasons I believe Black-on-Black homicide rates have fallen. And I see no good reason to attribute most of this to the police. Black people certainly do not feel as though the cops are keeping them safe, as they often are more nervous around them than they are even the roughest looking people in their neighborhoods. I know I am, even if I am completely innocent of any wrongdoing. How many blacks do you know actually feel safe around police? So even if you want to argue, which I won't, that the police have done a great job at keeping black people safe, they've certainly not done a good job at making black people feel safe. But Shapiro, for whatever reason, believes that circumstances should never be taken into account when he compares people of color to other groups. In his mind, blacks living in Ferguson, Missouri should be held to the same standard as whites living in Beverly Hills. It's interesting because Shapiro openly states, rightfully so, that blacks live under a different set of conditions due to historic racism and inequality, but then completely ignores the fact that those circumstances affect people in ways that might result in bad behavior and poor decision-making. Don't get me wrong, I'm not excusing these things. I'm simply stating that suggesting that blacks as people are in some way solely responsible for their misfortunes by comparing them to whites under different circumstances where such bad choices would be less likely is intellectually dishonest. You can't say, look at those black youths joining gangs in Detroit and compare them to East Asians living in Yorba Linda. It's ridiculous. You grow up around gangs, you're more likely to join one, especially if you grow up poor. One of the things you'll often hear from Shapiro is that people should be judged as individuals, and you'll hear this from others as well, such as Jordan Peterson and idiots like Roaming Millennial, who is a well-known YouTube contributor. But let a black person hold up a liquor store. Let a black person drop out of high school or have kids out of wedlock. You think people like Shapiro are going to judge those people as individuals? Or is he going to chalk that up to the notion that blacks just simply don't value education or sexual responsibility?
You know what? Explain to me. You explain to me why black kids aren't graduating high school. Explain that one to me. Explain to me why black kids are shooting each other in rates significantly higher than whites are shooting each other. Explain to me why 13% of the population is responsible for 50% of the murder. Explain to me why the number of black kids in prison, not for innocent reasons, not for walking down the street and getting pulled into a prison, is so high.
Shapiro will say things like 13% of the population is responsible for half the homicides in America, which on its face is blaming all black people for the crimes of a tiny minority of their population. I make up part of that 13%. I've never killed anyone, and if you are a black person listening to this, you probably haven't either. But this is the subtle art of robbing black people of their individuality while at the same time claiming to embrace it. A black person is loud at a restaurant. Oh, black people are so loud. A black student acts up in class. Well, you know how they are. Black people don't see themselves as individuals. We don't see whites as individuals. We see ourselves as an identity group because that is how the world sees us, and most of all, that's how the world treats us. One of the main pillars of Ben Shapiro's arguments is that not being poor simply comes down to 3 decisions one can make in his or her life.
So here are the 3 rules. You want to be rich in America? You want to do well in America? You want to put aside the whining about the system? Again, you point out to me an individual instance of racism, I will stand next to you and fight it. But if you want to whine about America, no good. Okay, here are the 3 rules that you need to fulfill as a person before you can start complaining about your life failures being the result of somebody else's actions. Number 1, you need to finish high school. Number 2, you need to get married before you have babies. Number 3, you need to get a job. That's it. You do those things, you will not be permanently poor in the United States of America.
Now, this is not something Shapiro came up with on his own. He's citing from an article written by Ron Haskins of the Brookings Institute. His conclusions were based on research that was done that showed that there was indeed a sizable correlation between making these 3 decisions and a middle to upper class standard of living. Only about 2% of the people who failed in all 3 of these things were living at least a middle class life, and people who followed all 3, 76% of them were. Of course, Shapiro and others like him are going to be really attracted to research like this because it makes things simple. The more that can be explained in simple sound bites, the better. And again, it plays to those same stereotypes discussed earlier, that blacks aren't doing as well because of their, quote, inferior culture and values. If they only made these easy decisions, they would be just fine. Shapiro's problem when comparing whites to blacks is, again, he assumes everyone lives in a vacuum and circumstances have no impact on the decisions people make. If you are living in a place that has been poor for generations and under conditions that are more stressful and more difficult, it is going to be harder to make those good choices Ben Shapiro believes will lead to a middle-class life. Again, I'm not saying we shouldn't hold people accountable for the decisions they make, but comparing them to whites who do not have to face such challenges and then saying, oh, those people must be in some way less cultured or inferior as people is completely unfair. So the first one I want to look at is find a full-time job. Really? You don't think finding a full-time job is going to be easier if you're a white person living in an all-white neighborhood, having attended an all-white school? Black and brown spaces not only are less likely to have jobs, but they're less likely to have well-paying ones. Blacks are less likely to have the job skills necessary out of high school to find well-paying jobs. It certainly isn't because black people don't want to work. And then what about don't have kids before you're married or at the age of 21? Poverty and education are much stronger predictors of teen pregnancy than culture or religious beliefs. The most religious states in the country also happen to be the ones with the highest teen pregnancy rates, regardless of race. Arkansas has the highest teen pregnancy rate in the United States, according to the CDC. 15% black population, according to the 2010 census. New York State, on the other hand, 16% black population and a larger percentage of Hispanics, yet has less than half the teen pregnancy rate. None of this in any way, however, suggests that we shouldn't hold people accountable for being sexually irresponsible, but again, different circumstances. So when comparing black teens to white teens, this must be taken into account. And speaking of that, about out-of-wedlock births, you often hear this about black and Latina women. Oh, they're just having babies out of wedlock. First of all, the actual number of black babies being born out of wedlock is the lowest it has been in decades. The reason why you often hear that 73% number is because black married couples are having fewer children. So naturally, the percentage of babies being born out of wedlock will rise as a result of that. I believe mass incarceration also has a negative impact as it impedes upon the black family. Black male unemployment also is a contributing factor, if not actually the biggest. If a black man is jobless and can't take care of his family, this sorely affects his ability to be a parent to his children. So it's rather dishonest to compare whites who are more likely to live in environments better suited for raising a family to blacks who have a totally different set of challenges they have to deal with. But I really think that folks like Ben Shapiro do a great job of relating to their audience. Ben Shapiro's audience probably doesn't like black and brown folks any more than he does. Many of them see blacks as, quote, full of excuses and are tired of, quote, hearing them complain. When you've been taught from birth that where you end up is all about you and the myth of racial meritocracy, and then black people are out here complaining about such rhetoric and suggesting that everything you were taught by your white parents, your white teachers, your white pastor, your white friends and neighbors, and the white-dominated media about race may be wrong, and that not only do we not live in a meritocracy, but we live in a system of inequality that disadvantages people of color, often for the benefit of whites. That's difficult to hear. That really is tough to hear, so I get it. This is not to say that there aren't a lot of white people who struggle, but for every one white person who struggles, there are probably two people of color in America who have it just as bad or probably even worse. And not only that, but even if you are white and are in the direst of straits, you can at least take comfort in knowing that the world will be far more understanding. You can stand in line at the welfare office knowing you probably will not be stereotyped as a welfare queen. When you send your kids to school, you probably will not have to worry about whether or not them being poor will help perpetuate a stereotype about not only you, but your entire race. You probably wouldn't be as worried if on their way home they have an encounter with the police. Should race matter? No, it shouldn't. It's a myth. However, and unfortunately, the idea that systemic racism is not a thing and that it's all an illusion made up in the heads of people of color is a myth too. Shapiro is rhetorically very talented. He's a great apologist for these myths that have lived in this country for years and have been used to justify the very racism we're trying to fight against. So no, maybe Shapiro isn't personally a racist, but that doesn't mean he's any friend of ours.